Imagine this relentless, hidden global struggle. It's not fought with, tanks or troops, but with ledgers, algorithms, and sometimes really ancient networks of trust.
Yeah.
Today on The Deep Dive, we're plunging into the shadow economy of terror. We're exploring that constantly evolving financial battle, between terrorist organizations and the global efforts trying to stop them.
It's a fascinating and pretty complex world.
Absolutely. And our mission today is really to give you a shortcut, a way to understand this incredibly complex picture. We want to uncover the, surprising ingenuity of these illicit actors.
And also the impact, right? The impact of the countermeasures, which can sometimes be, unintended.
Exactly. By the end of this deep dive, you should really be able to see those financial threads woven into the very fabric of global security. Now, before we really jump in, there's a vital distinction we need to make clear. It's between two terms people often confuse: money laundering, ML, and terrorist financing, TFS. Money laundering, it's fundamentally about hiding the illegal origin of money, making dirty money look clean. But terrorist financing, that's different, isn't it?
It really is. TF is primarily concerned with concealing the destination and the purpose of the funds.
Oh, okay.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is that the money in TF can often come from perfectly legitimate sources, like charitable donations or even just someone's regular salary.
Oh, okay.
And this difference is crucial. It explains the unique challenges, often much more subtle in countering it. You could have a small, seemingly harmless transaction funded legitimately, that ends up being the final step in financing a truly devastating attack. That distinction really shapes the whole global response.
That really drives home the challenge, doesn't it? So, okay, how did this hidden battle even begin, and where is it, heading?
Well, it's got deep roots.
We're going to trace how groups first funded their operations, dissect the huge game-changing impact of 9/11.
A definite turning point.
Look at how organizations like Hezbollah and ISIS adapted. They're very different beasts.
Too adaptive, yeah.
And finally, look at the complex future landscape, including, as you said, some surprising unintended consequences of trying to stop it.
Right.
So how far back does this shadow economy actually go? You might be surprised, actually. Some of their most effective methods are, centuries old.
That's true.
They didn't just invent new financial networks out of thin air. They kind of twisted the trust and complexity of existing ones.
Exactly. They exploited what was already there.
And one of the oldest, most enduring methods is something called Hawala.
Ah, Hawala, yes. It's an informal value transfer system, an IVTS. Its roots are in ancient South Asian and Middle Eastern trade. It predates modern banking by centuries.
So it's not inherently criminal?
Not at all. It's actually a vital channel for remittances, sending money home for millions globally. It's based entirely on trust. The mechanism is elegantly simple, really.
Does it work then?
A client gives funds to a hawaladar that's a money broker in one country. That hawaladar then contacts a counterpart, someone they trust, in another country, and just tells them to pay the equivalent amount to the recipient, often using just a simple code for authentication.
Right. And the key thing here, as I understand it, is that no money physically crosses borders through that specific transaction.
Precisely. The hawaladars, they settle their debts later, often completely outside the formal banking system, maybe through trade, maybe through cash.
So from a security perspective, what's the biggest headache that creates for, authorities trying to track this stuff?
Oh, it creates a huge one. Hawala offers anonymity, speed, it's low cost, and there's a minimal paper trail, if any. And crucially, it gives access to regions where formal banking is weak or maybe doesn't even exist. This lack of direct supervision makes it profoundly vulnerable to abuse.
Has it been used historically for terrorism?
Oh, yes. Long before 9/11, it was used to fund terrorism in places like Kashmir. And after 9/11, investigations showed Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, like the Al-Barakaat network, used Hawala extensively, moving funds covertly to operatives in Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, you name it.
So if this system is so easily exploited, how did the international community even begin to tackle it?
Well, the international response, and this was really led by bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. They've tried to bring hawaladars into the regulatory fold, requiring them to register as money service businesses, keep records, that sort of thing.
That must be difficult.
It is. The constant challenge, though, is that if you over-regulate, you risk driving the legitimate operators further underground, which actually makes them even harder to track. It's a fine balance.
Yeah, tricky. Okay, another really insidious method is the abuse of nonprofit organizations, NPOs, charities.
Ah, yes, the dual-use dilemma, as it's sometimes called.
Right, because NPOs, they're pillars of civil society, right? They provide essential services, often get tax breaks.
Exactly, and terrorist groups exploit that public legitimacy, that global reach, and the financial privileges that come with it.
How do they do that? Is it just setting up fake charities?
Sometimes, yes. Establishing front organizations that exist solely to raise funds for terrorism under some legitimate-sounding cause. But more commonly, it's the diversion of funds from legitimate charities.
So money given in good faith gets siphoned off.
Precisely. A portion of donations meant for, say, humanitarian relief or religious education gets secretly funneled into militant activities. And this commingling of, good money and bad money makes detection incredibly difficult for donors and for authorities.
It seems like groups have been exploiting charities for a long, long time. Can you give us a sense of how prevalent this was? Maybe an early example?
Absolutely. It's not new. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, for instance, some of the funding was traced back to a company whose business was importing holy water.
Yeah.
Seems innocuous, right? And even before 9/11, Hamas built this huge global fundraising network that relied heavily on NPOs, like the US-based Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development. It funneled millions to Hamas-controlled charity committees.
And Al-Qaeda did this too.
Oh, extensively. They used various charities, often disguising funds as support for orphanages or, mosque construction. It really highlights how they prey on generosity and trust.
It's chilling. And then there's trade-based money laundering, TBML. That just sounds incredibly complex, like something out of a spy novel.
It kind of is. TBML is all about disguising criminal proceeds and moving value across borders using, on the surface, legitimate trade transactions.
So they hide it in imports and exports.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
And it wasn't actually invented by terrorists. It was perfected by transnational criminal organizations like drug cartels. Terror groups sort of adapted these methods. It shows this, symbiotic relationship, you could call it, where they learn techniques from organized crime. The classic example is the black market peso exchange used by Colombian cartels way back in the 80s.
Okay, so how does TBML actually work?
Right.
How do they hide money in plain sight within, massive global trade flows?
Well, it revolves around misrepresenting key parts of a trade deal. The most common techniques are over and under invoicing. Meaning, you misrepresent the price of the goods to transfer value. For example, you ship cheap plastic toys, but invoice them as high-tech electronics worth a fortune. That difference is the value you've moved illicitly. Or you do the opposite.
Got it.
They might also do multiple invoicing for the same shipment, create phantom shipments that never existed, or lie about the quality or quantity of goods. Essentially, they use the sheer enormous volume of daily global trade as the ultimate cover. It makes individual transactions incredibly complex and really hard for customs or banks to verify.
Right, but then everything shifted in 2001.
Yeah.
September 11th.
A seismic shift.
The sheer audacity, but also the kind of simplicity of the 9/11 financing just ripped apart everyone's assumptions. It was a true watershed moment. Fundamentally altered global security, international finance, everything.
It really did. Let's look at the actual financing of those attacks. The entire operation cost Al-Qaeda maybe $400,000 to $500,000.
That seems surprisingly low, given the impact.
It's incredibly low, especially when you compare it to the billions, maybe trillions, spent globally on compliance and security afterwards. And the financial footprint of the 19 hijackers, it was deliberately, utterly unremarkable.
So they weren't doing complex schemes?
Not at all. No complex layering or integration like you see with drug money. Instead, they relied on 3 really mundane, unexceptional methods.
Okay, what were those everyday methods they used?
Primarily wire transfers. About $130,000 came via wire transfers from Al-Qaeda facilitators, people like Ali Abdulaziz Ali in the UAE, Ramzi bin Al-Shib in Germany, straight into the hijackers' accounts in the US.
Okay, wires. What else?
They also used physical cash and traveler's checks that they just carried into the U.S. And standard debit and credit cards for routine ATM withdrawals once they were here.
So they were just using everyday financial tools, like anyone else.
Yeah.
What does that imply for actually detecting it beforehand?
Precisely. That's the terrifying part. Once they were in the U.S., the hijackers opened something like 24 normal checking and savings accounts at 4 different banks. They used legal passports, legal visas.
And their spending.
Their transaction patterns. deposits coming in, followed by frequent small withdrawals for rent, food, travel, flight school tuition. It was completely indistinguishable, as the 9/11 Commission put it, from millions of other students or temporary residents.
So no red flags were raised?
Not a single one. Consequently, not one suspicious activity report, a SAR, was filed by any financial institution before the attacks.
Wow. And there was that common myth about Osama bin Laden funding it all personally, right? From his supposed inheritance?
Yes, and the investigation really dispelled that myth. While he provided some seed money, in Al-Qaeda's early days, the organization's actual budget, maybe around $30 million a year back then, was sustained by a network of donors, mostly in the Gulf region.
And how was that funneled?
Often through the abuse of Islamic charities and mosques, going back to what we discussed earlier. And this raises a really important question, I think.
Which is?
If such a devastating attack could be funded so simply, so invisibly, through perfectly conventional channels, what does that say about the limitations of a financial system that was really designed to detect huge sums of drug money, not relatively modest budgets for catastrophic acts?
That question really hung in the air, didn't it?
Yeah.
And it led directly to this global regulatory revolution, starting almost immediately with the USA Patriot Act in 2001.
Yeah, enacted incredibly quickly. Just 45 days after 9/11, the Patriot Act completely reshaped the U.S. anti-money laundering, or AML, and counter-terrorist financing, CFT, regime.
What were the key parts of that?
Well, one of the most powerful tools was Section 311. It gave the U.S. Treasury this unprecedented power to designate a foreign bank or even a whole jurisdiction as a primary money laundering concern.
What did that mean?
It meant they could impose special measures, like basically cutting that entity off from the U.S. financial system, prohibiting U.S. banks from dealing with them. It turned a regulatory tool into this really potent instrument of economic coercion, a kind of financial death sentence, really, without needing anyone else's approval.
So, real teeth. What else?
It also mandated much stronger due diligence from banks, especially for foreign correspondent accounts, basically know your customer's customer, or KYCC, and it prohibited U.S. banks from servicing foreign shell banks. Plus, it explicitly brought those informal networks like Hawala under the Bank Secrecy Act regulations for the first time.
So the U.S. acted fast and decisively. But what about the rest of the world? Did everyone else follow suit? Was it a global response?
Oh, absolutely. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, that intergovernmental body we mentioned, originally set up to fight drug money laundering.
Right.
They pivoted immediately. In October 2001, just weeks after the attacks, they started addressing terrorist financing directly. They swiftly issued these special recommendations, initially 8, later 9.
And what did those recommendations require countries to do?
They required countries worldwide to criminalize terrorist financing as a distinct offense, to freeze terrorist assets, to report suspicious transactions related to terrorism, to impose AML-CFT rules on alternative remittance systems like Hawala, and crucially, to ensure nonprofits couldn't be abused.
And how did FATF enforce this globally?
These recommendations were quickly integrated into their core standards, and through FATF's system of mutual evaluations, basically peer reviews, and its public listings, the famous blacklist and gray list, it effectively compels countries worldwide to adopt and implement these measures. It became the de facto global standard setter for fighting both money laundering and terrorist financing.
Okay, so the world responds with this regulatory revolution, hardening the formal financial system, making it tougher. But, as we keep saying, our adversaries, they adapt. They're incredibly adaptive.
Always.
So let's look at how two major groups, Hezbollah and ISIS, innovated their funding models in this new, much stricter environment. They took different paths, didn't they?
Very different. Hezbollah represents maybe the modern evolution of a terrorist organization into this incredibly sophisticated hybrid entity. It blends political, military, social, and criminal functions seamlessly.
Hybrid meaning?
Meaning its deep integration with transnational organized crime really blurs the lines. It demonstrates a model where terror and crime are, well, fully symbiotic, as some officials have put it. They feed off each other.
That sounds like an incredibly diversified financial portfolio. Must make them resilient. What are its core components?
It truly is diversified, which insulates it from single points of failure. Foundational, of course, is state sponsorship. The Islamic Republic of Iran remains Hezbollah's key patron, providing, estimates suggest, several $100 million per year in direct support.
Wow, several $100 million. But beyond Iran?
Beyond Iran, it operates as a sophisticated transnational criminal enterprise. U.S. officials even refer to its business affairs component. It's deeply involved in large-scale narcotics, trafficking cocaine globally, producing drugs like Captagon, and very sophisticated money laundering, both for itself and as a service for other criminal syndicates.
And other crimes, too.
Yeah, things like intellectual property crime, pirated software, fake goods, cigarette smuggling, various types of fraud. They have significant operational and financial hubs across the globe, the tri-border area of South America, West Africa, Europe, the Middle East, often leveraging diaspora communities.
And that old idea that maybe they kept their political money separate from their, terrorist funds.
That myth has been thoroughly debunked. Intelligence and law enforcement actions have shown the funds are fungible. They're managed as a unified enterprise. Money is money, and it all goes into the same pot, essentially.
Okay, and there's a really fascinating case study that illustrates this perfectly, right? The Lebanese Canadian Bank, LCB. You described it as a masterclass in modern money laundering.
Mm-hmm. The LCB case was indeed a masterclass. It perfectly showed this fusion of drug money and complex trade-based money laundering operating across multiple jurisdictions. It's centered on the U.S. used car market, believe it or not.
Used cars, how did that work?
Okay, so proceeds from cocaine sales, mostly in Europe and the Middle East, were funneled to Hezbollah-linked money exchange houses in Lebanon. These guys had accounts at LCB.
Guys.
LCB then wired huge sums, over $300 million, into the United States. That money went to about 30 different U.S.-based used car dealerships.
Okay.
These companies bought thousands of used vehicles, shipped them mainly to West Africa, particularly Benin. There, the cars were sold for cash.
And then the cash.
That cash was then consolidated and physically smuggled back to Lebanon through a network controlled by Hezbollah, using bulk cash smugglers, couriers, even Hawala networks. It was a scheme spanning 4 continents.
Wow. That is intricate. A truly global operation. How did the U.S. even respond to something that complex?
Well, in February 2011, the U.S. Treasury's FinCEN unit used that Section 311 power we talked about. They designated LCB as a financial institution of primary money laundering concern.
The Patriot Act tool.
Exactly. And crucially, this didn't require Lebanese cooperation. It just leveraged the absolute centrality of the U.S. dollar to global finance. The designation was effectively a corporate death sentence.
How so?
Global banks immediately cut ties. They de-risked, refusing to do business with LCB to avoid U.S. penalties themselves. LCB quickly became insolvent, it was sold off, and U.S. authorities eventually seized and forfeited somewhere between $100 million and $150 million connected to the scheme.
So it really worked.
It powerfully demonstrated the immense effectiveness of these U.S. secondary sanctions. Basically, the threat of exclusion from the U.S. financial system can be the most potent weapon against a globalized illicit network.
Okay, so that's Hezbollah, the hybrid criminal terrorist model. Now let's turn to ISIS. They represented another really significant shift, right? More like a proto-state model for financing terror. Completely different.
Completely different, yeah. Although likely somewhat anomalous in the grand scheme, ISIS departed significantly from Al-Qaeda's network externally funded model, and also from Hezbollah's hybrid model. Instead, ISIS developed this unique structure based on direct control and systematic exploitation of territory, resources, and populations. It functioned, for a time, like a self-sufficient proto-state.
Self-sufficient. How much money are we talking about?
At its peak, around 2014-2015, ISIS generated enormous wealth internally from the territory controlled in Iraq and Syria. Estimates put its cash reserves back then as high as $500 million. $500 million.
$500 million. That's astonishing. How did they generate that much money internally, like a self-funding terrorist state?
Well, their primary revenue streams were, first, control of natural resources. They seized oil and gas fields and sold the crude oil and refined products through smuggling networks, especially into Turkey. That generated tens of millions of dollars per month.
Okay, oil. What else?
Second, taxation and extortion. They set up this sophisticated and utterly brutal bureaucracy to tax millions of people and businesses under their control. This included religious taxes like zakat, commercial taxes, tolls on roads, fees for basic services. That alone could generate maybe $30 million a month.
So they taxed the population they controlled.
Exactly. And third, looting and confiscation. They looted hundreds of millions of dollars from banks, especially when they took cities like Mosul, and they confiscated property from minorities or those deemed enemies, plus other criminal activities like kidnapping for ransom, especially foreigners, and smuggling antiquities.
So it really did function like a state, albeit a terrifying one.
Yeah.
But what was his main vulnerability, its Achilles heel?
Well, that state-based model, while providing unprecedented wealth, also created a huge strategic vulnerability: fixed physical economic assets. Oil wells, refineries, cash storage sites, tax offices, things you can see from the air.
Targets.
Exactly. The U.S.-led coalition systematically targeted this economic infrastructure with airstrikes. Operation Tidal Wave 2, it was called. And this led to a catastrophic decline in ISIS revenue. Their cash reserves dwindled dramatically, down to maybe an estimated $25 million by late 2022.
So hitting the infrastructure really crippled their finances. Now, as their caliphate shrunk, how did ISIS manage to finance its operations outside that territory? And what about all those foreign terrorist fighters, the FTFs?
Right, well, to move funds from their core territory to global affiliates, ISIS still used traditional methods. Cash couriers, Hawala, pretty standard stuff.
Okay.
However, the FTF phenomenon, thousands of people traveling from around the world to join ISIS, that introduced a slightly different financial model. Decentralized microfinancing.
Microfinancing, meaning small amounts.
Exactly. The funding for these individual foreign fighters, and also for the small-scale attacks carried out by ISIS supporters back in their home countries, was typically very low cost and often self-generated.
Can you give examples?
Sure. We've seen U.S. court cases, prosecutions, where individuals collected just over $1,600 to support their travel to Syria, or someone wiring money through a regular money services business for equipment. There was one U.S. citizen who paid a mere $500 to an alleged ISIS facilitator for help getting smuggled into Syria.
So tiny amounts, relatively speaking. What does this mean for detection then?
Well, these cases really underscore the immense challenge of detecting this kind of activity. The transactions are small. They're often funded from legitimate sources like salaries or benefits. They completely lack the clear red flags that traditional anti-money laundering systems are designed to catch. It's almost invisible noise.
Okay, so this global AML-CFT regime built up after 9/11, it definitely succeeded in, hardening the formal financial system, made it tougher to move large sums illicitly.
It certainly did raise the barriers, yes.
But this success, it hasn't come without significant cost and complex, often unintended consequences, things that have reshaped global finance, trade, even humanitarian aid delivery.
That's absolutely right. Think about the economic impacts first. All those heightened security protocols, the stringent inspections at ports, the increased documentation needed for trade, they directly raise the costs of doing business internationally.
So it adds friction to global trade.
Significant friction. Some studies have found that, say, a doubling in the number of terrorist attacks in a country can reduce its bilateral trade by around 4%. And these costs tend to hit time-sensitive goods and those just-in-time supply chains the hardest. So yeah, the fight against terrorist financing isn't just about security. It has real, tangible economic ripples across the globe, affecting legitimate businesses.
And perhaps one of the most acute unintended consequences, the one we hear a lot about, is this de-risking dilemma. Especially for nonprofit organizations, right? It seems like a classic catch-22.
It absolutely is a catch-22, and perhaps the most damaging unintended consequence. Faced with the threat of truly astronomical fines from regulators if they slip up, major international banks have adopted this strategy of de-risking. Which means wholesale termination or restriction of banking services to entire categories of customers they deem high risk. Not based on individual behavior, but just the category.
And NPOs fall into that category.
Legitimate NPOs that operate in or need to send funds to conflict zones, fragile states, or jurisdictions under sanctions are chief among those being de-risked. It's seen as just too risky for the banks to handle their business.
But that's a huge problem, surely.
It's a severe crisis. It's a rational business decision for the banks, given the penalties. But the result is that legitimate, often life-saving humanitarian organizations find themselves financially excluded. They can't open bank accounts, they can't wire funds easily. This directly hinders aid delivery. It undermines the foreign policy goals of the very governments that are pushing these regulations.
So by trying to make the system transparent, we might be pushing vital aid into less transparent channels.
Exactly. By closing off access to the formal, regulated, transparent banking system, de-risking might inadvertently force humanitarian aid, and maybe even NPO funds more broadly, to flow through less transparent, potentially riskier channels like cash or maybe even Hawala again, undermining the very transparency the regulations were designed to promote in the first place.
That's a serious dilemma. Okay, so as we look towards the horizon now, what does the current landscape look like? And what about future threats? How are new technologies shaping this ongoing battle?
Well, the digital frontier definitely presents significant new threats and also new opportunities for detection, potentially. Cryptocurrencies and virtual assets get a lot of attention.
Right. Are terrorist groups actually using crypto widely?
To date, the documented use by major groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda seems to have been relatively limited and mostly experimental. Things like online fundraising solicitations using Bitcoin. There are factors constraining wider adoption right now: price volatility, the technical expertise needed, and the fact that most public blockchain transactions are actually pseudonymous, not truly anonymous, and they are traceable with the right tools.
So the risk might be more future-focused.
The future risk is significant, yes, especially with things like anonymity-enhancing technologies, mixers, tumblers, and privacy-focused coins becoming more sophisticated. Those could potentially bypass the formal banking system more effectively. But regulators like FATF have been pretty proactive here.
How so?
FATF has already extended its standards to cover virtual asset service providers, or VASPs, think cryptocurrency exchanges, requiring them to get licensed, do customer due diligence, report suspicious activity, and comply with the travel rule, which means sharing originator and beneficiary information for transactions. The U.S. did something similar with the AML Act of 2020.
Okay, so crypto is one area. But you mentioned simpler digital threats too. Things may be more immediate.
Yeah, I think crowdfunding platforms and social media are arguably a more immediate and growing threat right now. These platforms allow terrorist groups and their supporters to solicit funds directly from a global audience with unprecedented ease and reach.
And that fits with that decentralized model.
Perfectly. It's particularly suited for that decentralized lone actor or small cell model, allowing them to raise small amounts relatively easily for low-cost attacks.
Which connects back to that clear trend you mentioned. This shift away from expensive, centrally planned attacks like 9/11.
Which cost maybe $500,000.
Towards low-cost, but still high-impact violence, carried out by lone individuals or small, self-directed cells.
Exactly. We've sometimes called it Nike terrorism, right? The 2015 Paris attacks cost maybe $10,000 total. The attackers in the 2015 Charlie Hebdo shooting in Paris reportedly funded part of their operation by selling counterfeit sneakers.
Counterfeit sneakers.
Wow. It highlights the challenge. The financing needs for a lone actor can be absolutely minimal. Often just enough for a used vehicle, a simple weapon, basic materials for a bomb perhaps. And these funds are typically sourced from perfectly legitimate income salaries, government benefits, maybe small personal loans, or this petty crime.
Which makes it almost invisible.
Almost entirely invisible to traditional AML CFT systems looking for large structured transactions or known bad actors. This really raises an important strategic question for the future, I think.
Go on.
Ultimately, countering terrorist financing effectively in the years ahead probably won't be about just building ever higher, ever thicker walls around the traditional banking system. It's going to be determined by our ability to achieve greater transparency across different types of financial flows, foster much more effective, timely intelligence sharing between governments and the private sector, and crucially, adapt our regulatory and technological tools to fight an adversary that is fluid, decentralized, and constantly evolving.
What a journey we've taken today. Seriously. We've gone from those ancient methods like Hawala and the abuse of charities through the transformative shock of 9/11 and the global regulatory revolution that followed.
That's a huge shift.
To looking at the really adaptive strategies of groups like Hezbollah and ISIS, so different from each other.
Always changing tactics.
And finally, touching on this new frontier of digital finance and the challenge of microfinancing, hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a truly comprehensive yet, digestible understanding of this incredibly complex global struggle, highlighting that constant innovation happening on both sides.
It's a constant cat and mouse game. And as this financial battlefield continues to shift, maybe here's a final thought to consider. Is the greatest risk moving forward no longer the single large traceable transaction that we've built systems to detect? But maybe it's the cumulative impact of thousands upon thousands of small, legitimate-looking transactions, ones made almost invisible by their very ordinariness. And if that's the case, what does that truly mean for how we strike that difficult balance between security and privacy in our increasingly decentralized world?